Hi, welcome to the episode. It's the latest in my series of conversations with people doing interesting things in fashion, culture and the arts. In this one, my guest is Colleen Hill, a curator of fashion and accessories at the museum at FIT, the Institute of Fashion and Technology in New York. And I'm talking to her about a new book she's published about 90s fashion. As someone who came of age in the 90s, I feel a special fondness for that time. But I was interested to ask Colleen how she feels it stands up under scrutiny when viewed from a 2020s perspective. Colleen Hill, welcome to the show. I'm in London and you are, I'm guessing, in New York.
I am, yes.
You're the curator of fashion and accessories at the museum at FIT, the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York. And you're also an author. Your latest book, which is called Reinvention and Restlessness, Fashion in the 90s, is out next month and published by Rizzoli Electa. And I believe there'll be a corresponding exhibition at FIT as well. Tell me a little bit about how this book came about, and also do you repeat the very nice comment you made to me earlier before we began the recording that this is a bit of an exclusive in the way that it's the first time you're speaking about the book.
It is. This is the first time I'm speaking about the book. I only just got my first physical copy of the book last week, which was really exciting. And overall, this project was a really fun and really challenging one because it was made during COVID. I stopped going into my office in mid-March of last year, and from the very first day that I was sitting at my home desk, I started writing this book and finished writing in a few months and working with my editor on getting all of the image permissions, and now it's come to fruition. So it was a really meaningful COVID project, which is great.
Congratulations. And why is now a good time to be speaking about the 90s, especially 90s fashion?
Sure. Well, there are a few reasons that I wanted to do this book and this exhibition. And I guess I'll start with the most professional reason, which was that I just saw a gap in fashion history books. There are a few really great books that were published around the turn of the millennium. I love Terry Egan's The End of Fashion, Rebecca Arnold's Fashion, Desire, and Anxiety, and Caroline Evans has a great book called Fashion at the Edge. And these are all books that throughout my work as a fashion curator over the past 15 years or so, I've consistently referenced. And what's great about them is that they all discuss 90s fashion, but from that period in time, and no one had really looked back at the 90s and written about it as we see it through more of a 21st century lens. So that was part of my interest in 90s fashion. I also started to see that we were getting a lot of really great donations or occasionally offers for purchase for objects for our permanent collection at the museum at FIT. We have about 50,000 objects, so a lot to choose from. And it's interesting that we get things sort of in waves. So I think this is a time when a lot of people, generally women who had really fantastic 90s wardrobes, are ready to let those go. So we're starting to see some really great acquisitions, which always helps to inspire an exhibition. And then on a more personal level, I've just always loved 1990s fashion. I'm sort of on the front end of the millennial generation, so as I like to say, I'm an old millennial, and I was a teenager during the 1990s. As you can guess, I really loved fashion. I was not really able to partake in high fashion in any way, but and then of course, over really the course of the past decade, I started to notice a number of 1990s trends making their way into fashion. And the benefit of working at a fashion school is that you see the trends first thing. And I just love seeing the students looking exactly like I looked in 1998. It's so great.
That's really interesting what you were saying about donations to the museum being up. Do you think that that's because of COVID lockdown, people clearing things out, or do you think it's to do with the time gap, women who maybe were younger at that time deciding they no longer need those pieces? And were there any amazing things that you can remember especially that came in?
Sure, I think a little bit of both. I hear from a lot of women that they hold on to clothing that they love for a certain period of time because they have an attachment to it. It was a favorite thing, or even something that, they spent a lot of money on and they just want to hang on to it for a while. And then there usually is a 10, 20, 30-year gap before they're ready to part with it. They sort of accept that they're never going to wear this again for whatever reason. And some of them are very generous and decide to donate to us rather than to sell. Of course, selling is also a completely legitimate thing to do. But it does seem to be a good time when people are letting go of things. And I won't name names, but one thing that came to us recently that was very exciting was a really gorgeous McQueen for Givenchy dress, unlike anything we had in our collection already. So that is definitely making its way into my exhibition. So those types of acquisitions are always really exciting, that fill a really important gap.
Going back to what you were saying about the appeal of the 90s, I mean, there is a lot of nostalgia around that time. And do you think that a lot of it feeds into this idea of being the last pre-internet moment? I mean, if you think about American Vogue has a podcast about 90s fashion, and it's this idea of it's almost like when fashion was fun, I think someone said to me not that long ago. Do you think there's an element of that which is part of its appeal as well to younger people today?
I think so. I've thought a lot about the reasons for the love of 1990s fashion, and I think there are quite a few reasons. I cannot take credit for this, but I read this incredible article by Robin Gavon, which was from, I think, 2019, so it was pre-COVID, and she wrote about why we're all so obsessed with the 90s, and I think obsessed was her word. And she mentioned that the problems we were facing in that decade, which included things like fear over Y2K, which is something I address a little bit in the book and remember, actually, and mourning the death of Princess Diana and the Gulf War. Obviously, all of these were real problems during the 1990s, but as we've been through this recent period in particular of political turmoil, I think we are looking back at the 90s as this idyllic time. So even those problems that they were facing then seem minor to us now. So I think on a more social political level, that's part of it. But thinking more specifically about why the fashion itself is so important. I think one of the things that's interesting to note is that there were so many 90s trends, just so many. And obviously I've studied a lot of fashion history. It's part of my job. I would argue that trends cycled in and out more quickly, and there were probably more of them during the 90s than ever before. And I think that helped everyone to partake in fashion in some way. In a way, there was something for everyone, and I think that's extended into the 21st century. There's no sort of one overarching style that's fashionable. I think another thing to consider from the 90s is that clothing was becoming increasingly accessible economically. So fast fashion was something that was really starting to take off during the 90s. And of course, now we're all familiar with the price that we're paying, both environmentally and creatively, for fast fashion. But at the time, it was really exciting to be able to purchase something that looked so close to a runway look at a really accessible price point. And then I would also say that so many runway trends were easily adopted by many people in various ways. So something like grunge was literally a copy you could style by going to the thrift store and buying a vintage dress and a flannel shirt.
That trend for second-hand clothing and vintage is one of the main themes, and something that you explore in the book, of course. In terms of fashion itself, and you mentioned grunge already, but what are some of the key moments? I mean, you pick them out in your book, and anyone who reads it will get to really see your amazing analysis of those trends and some beautiful images to accompany it. But to your mind, what are the ones that you pick out and why?
Sure. Well, I structured the book literally into two categories, which are reinvention and restlessness. And the reason I did that was because tackling an entire decade in fashion is a huge challenge. It's just something that I knew I would never be able to include everything. It's a decade that many people, including myself, as I mentioned, remember well. So as I was putting together the content of the exhibition and the show, or the book, excuse me, I was thinking, how can I really condense my ideas into the most significant moments? And reinvention really centers on the idea of the reinvention of luxury. And that's really coming out of the 1980s, which were arguably one of the most ostentatious and overtly lavish periods in fashion. And that's not to say that that wasn't an exciting time in fashion or a great one, but it was certainly something that people were ready to move on from. And you even start to see that by the late 1980s. And so something like grunge and also minimalism, which in many ways, although they're very aesthetically different, are conceptually similar. They're both things that were conceived as a reaction to that overt luxury, and in very different ways. Again, grunge was something that, even though high fashion designers did work on collections inspired by it, it was also something that you could style yourself for $5. Minimalism was kind of on the opposite end. It was something that looked really simple, but in its best form was very expensive. So it was about this purity of line, the cut, the fit, the fabrics. So these were the types of things that I was trying to tease out, and thinking about these overarching categories, even something like avant-garde fashion. I absolutely adore Martin Margiela. He's one of my favorite designers, hands down, ever. So this is not any kind of criticism of his work, but if you think about how much Margiela is credited for really breaking down the fashion system and changing the way we think about fashion, all of that is true, but it's also really important to note that his clothing was luxury clothing. It was very expensive. In many instances, it was completely one of a kind. So it wasn't accessible. It wasn't something that, in the way we're able to consume fashion, really changed things. It really just it was more of a critique on the existing fashion industry, if that makes sense.
It does make sense, but I suppose you could apply that to almost any high-end luxury fashion brand or designer. Going right back to couture, it's always been something that only the wealthy can afford.
Yes, exactly.
And until the advent of high-street fashion, which copies those trends, that's when it's become sort of accessible to all. But I also you mentioned Martin Margiela, and I also am a huge fan of his, and and what I wanted to talk to you about was this idea of what's endured out of those trends. Grunge is perhaps the most sort of famous trend that's always referenced from the 90s, but in a way it's the Margiela and Helmut Lang and these ideas of deconstruction and those avant-gardists that have endured. Margiela had his exhibition in Paris a few years ago, retrospective, and the Hermès retrospective, which was shown at the same time there. And I was lucky enough to visit them, and the main thing that struck me was just how much designers today copy what he did, and how modern and contemporary it all still feels.
I completely agree. And I would argue that Margiela, if not the most important designer of the 90s, was certainly one of the most important. And his influence has been immense. And anything you can find from the 90s, whether it's that sort of one-of-a-kind catwalk material, which is, of course, much harder to find, or the type of more wholesale clothing he was actually selling, it still looks completely contemporary, and it's so collectible. We are very lucky at our museum to have some really great early one-of-a-kind pieces. So, for example, we have a pair of the Tabi boots that were from the spring 1990 collection. They're actually signed on the sole by Margiela, which the show was presented in 89, so it says Margiela.
And those are the
1989.
boots with the split toe.
Exactly, yes.
Based on the Japanese flip-flops
style.
I call
Yeah,
them.
exactly.
But they're not really flip-flops, but yeah, thong, yeah.
Yeah, and they were introduced really from the start of the house in the late 1980s and continue to be a real signature of Margiela's style. And so we're so lucky to have these boots, which are a sort of canvas material that's been heavily overpainted with white paint, so they were meant to crack and disintegrate before your eyes as you wore them. But as far as I know, they were only worn once on the runway, so they're not terribly disintegrated. But this is the type of thing that, Margiela often created clothing that was meant to be ephemeral and meant to fall apart. And museums are often trying to preserve things, and that's exactly what we've done. So it's really exciting to have some of these pieces that we literally could never get today. It would just be so difficult to find these things.
Do you have any stories or memories or things that you uncovered as a writer when you were writing this book that surprised you or that you didn't know previously?
Yeah, a few things. I had this inkling that grunge as a high fashion trend was a sort of blip on the radar, and I was not wrong about that. There's really one season, which is spring 93, that you see grunge making its way into high fashion. So to be perfectly honest...
So it was sort of the Marc Jacobs Perry Ellis show, and then that shoot that happened in American Vogue that Mizell shot.
Exactly, and there was a sort of trio in the U.S. It was Anna Sui, Christian Francis Roth, and Marc Jacobs for Perry Ellis, all of whom did grunge-influenced collections in the same season. And certainly Marc Jacobs' collection is the most famous, in part because it resulted in his getting fired from Perry Ellis, because it was just not quite at the Perry level, Perry Ellis brand. But it certainly helped to accelerate his fame and made him this sort of arbiter of cool rebellion. And I should also mention that he introduced this grunge redux collection in 2018, which was essentially copies of pieces from that collection, which was really great. But yeah, the grunge phenomenon was quite interesting because it really had this short moment in time in high fashion. And I pretty much knew that was the case, but what I hadn't expected was that there was this real kind of vitriol against the grunge look. And so one of the funny things that I found was a letter from the editor in Anna Wintour's early days at Vogue, and she's basically rejoicing that the grunge look is dying out, but she won't even write grunge. She talks around it. It's like she can't even use the word. She's so sick of it. So that kind of thing was kind of funny to find.
Was that in her editor's letter in the magazine?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, I can imagine
so
Anna Wintour not embracing that look so too much.
Right. Yeah, and she loved, as far as I know, she loved Marc Jacobs, so I think it was probably a little challenging for her. But anyway, that was really fun. And then I also had some really great experiences overall with photographers and trying to make this project work in a really challenging time. So, for example, there was this image of Chloe Sevigny for a catalog for the label X-Girl. And X-Girl was founded by Kim Gordon, who was one of the musicians in Sonic Youth, and Daisy Von Firth, who was then, I believe, working primarily as a stylist. And I have always loved this brand. Even as a teenager, I was aware of this brand, and I always wanted something from X-Girl and never had it. But I found this great ad, or some kind of image of Chloe that I knew was X-Girl. And that was all I knew about it. I knew it was X-Girl, I knew it was Chloe Sevigny, and so I ended up posting it on my Instagram, hoping that someone could help me identify more about it. And dozens of people either commented or messaged me, and I eventually worked out what campaign it was. Someone sent me more pages from the catalog. Someone identified the photographer, whose name is Cliff Norton. Unfortunately, I was never able to find him. So if somehow he's listening to this, I'd love to send Cliff a book. But I also was contacted by Daisy Von Firth, which was really great. And she was like, oh, I might have this catalog somewhere if you need me to scan it. And we ended up getting a great enough image to use in the book. But just that kind of community feeling, and I think that people had the time to engage with this sort of thing more than they would pre-COVID. So there were some really fun stories just trying to make things work in a challenging time, and it really helped to sort of build my morale around the book as well.
And I guess it's also just further evidence of the enduringness of the 90s. And how do you feel the 90s stands up, looking at it through a 2020s prism? I mean, everything is so politicised now, not just in fashion, but in everything. How do you feel it? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I did a chapter in the book on what I call the global wardrobe. And that was a really challenging chapter to write because it's essentially about cultural appropriation. And it's a tricky subject because, of course, times change. So I'm looking back at the 90s through these 2020, 2021 eyes and thinking, oh, that's absolutely terrible. How could anyone do this? But it was a
Can you give an example? Give an example of one of the images you're talking about.
Sure. There's a John Galliano for Dior war bonnet that is a part of one of his really famous collections for Dior Couture. And this is not to disparage John Galliano or any designer. That was not my intent in writing this. My intent was that we are all, or hopefully all, looking at that type of appropriation much differently now. So it's the type of thing that is very problematic through our eyes today, but was in many ways considered to be the celebration of a global world during the 1990s. And you see it from many designers. It's certainly not just Galliano. I give the example of Jean-Paul Gaultier, who I think is a great example of this. He's someone who is known for appropriating a lot of ideas. He's spoken a lot about it, but you also just can't put him in that corner as someone who's stolen from other cultures, and I'm using a word he used in one of his interviews, because he was someone who was incredibly interested in diversity and inclusivity through the use of models, for example, who were of different body types and different races, etc. So you can't just pigeonhole someone into this certain way that they designed, because there's so many layers to it. So that was a big challenge to write about. But I would say in general, although we have a very long way to go in the fashion industry, certainly we've made a lot of progress. You know, in the 90s, the big thing was, oh, we're moving away from the perfection of Cindy Crawford and Naomi Campbell and Linda Evangelista into Kate Moss. I mean, you know, Kate Moss was a very different type of model in the early 90s, but looking back, certainly not as different or diverse as what I would hope we're trying to move forward with today.
Yeah, and that's a nice place to end, actually, to think that even though it was a time when we look back through rose-tinted spectacles at when fashion was fun and so on, actually today we're a lot wiser somehow. It feels like we know a lot more and things have got better in a lot of ways. So pros and cons.
Exactly. We're getting there. We're moving forward, I think.
Progress. It's all progress. Colleen, thank you so much for joining me today. I've really enjoyed speaking with you, and I'm delighted that you took the time to speak to me before anyone else. I feel very flattered, and I look forward to purchasing a copy of the book when it's finally on the shelves, which I think is 16th of March. So I look forward to seeing it then. Thank you.
Thank you.
You've been listening to In Talks with me, Danielle Radojcin. The sound and theme music were by Wargie Productions, and the artwork is by Patrick Waugh. If you enjoyed this episode, please pass it on to someone who you think might also like it. And of course, please do subscribe and leave a review. Thanks for listening.